Howdy. In this video, we'll be starting a new chapter, Chapter 5, Terms, Predicates, and Universal Quantifiers. This section, 5.1, is just going to introduce us to the limits of propositional logic and the need for a new type of logic. And that new type of logic, as we'll see, is called predicate logic. Here, we're going to think about the major limitation of propositional logic. Now, in propositional logic, we can only deal with the various logical relations between sentences. For example, parentheses P or Q, close parentheses, and R. Obviously, there are three atomic sentences, P, Q, and R. And they're related by sentential connectives. We have the or, we have the and. And in propositional logic, this is all we can do. We have given atomic sentences, and we relate them via sentential connectives. But this is a big limitation. We cannot work within a sentence. Predicate logic allows us to do just that. We can think about what is within a given single sentence, whereas in propositional logic, we can only think about the relations between sentences. We can never think about what's within a given sentence. In fact, because of that, propositional logic, it turns out, cannot tell us that the most famous argument in all of logic is valid. What's the most famous argument? Well, naturally, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now think about that argument in terms of propositional logic. The first premise, all men are mortal, we'll say is P. Second premise, Socrates is mortal, we'll say is Q. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. How should we write Socrates is mortal? It's not, so to speak, a combination of the first two premises, in the sense that we cannot form a molecular sentence with the atomic sentence P and Q, so we're going to have to give it another letter. It's another sentence. For example, we'll give it the letter R. So therefore, R. But if we have the premise P and the premise Q, there's no way we can validly derive the conclusion R. So propositional logic cannot help us here. But if we consider the argument, and we think about, so to speak, what's within the given sentences, it seems obvious that it is valid, and it is valid. We have all men are mortal as the first premise. Second premise, Socrates is a man. But if Socrates is a man, he's a member of mankind, and we know that all men are mortal. So therefore, it does follow that Socrates is mortal. Traditional logic would say that the subject, Socrates, and the predicate of mortality are linked by the so-called middle term, which happens to be men, or mankind. So we need more tools. We need another logic system. Propositional logic is too limited. And we can't even analyze the most famous of all arguments in logic. So we need to get into predicate logic. Section 5.1 from the Suppes and Hill textbook is very, very short, and in my mind, the paramount lesson to draw from it is also very, very simple. It's just that propositional logic is extremely limited and, indeed, one might say, limiting in the tools it has at its disposal. For example, if we consider this argument, or this argument, or this argument, we have three categorical syllogisms. But propositional logic simply cannot handle those types of arguments. Thus, we need new additional tools. We need a new logic. But in any case, I only want to look at a few of the problems the textbook provides, starting at page 181. Exercise 1A tells us, in part, that in the following arguments, both the premises and the conclusions are atomic sentences. Although the conclusions cannot be derived by the rules and methods you know now, some of the arguments are valid and others are not. The question is, using our intuitions, is the following argument valid or invalid? Where propositional logic simply cannot help us. Now, if you know, for example, traditional Aristotelian logic, these problems will be a piece of cake. But even if you don't know that, they're also pretty straightforward. Number 2 tells us that some students study logic. All students who study logic know the word premise. Therefore, some students know the word premise. Is it valid or invalid? I suppose we could draw a Venn diagram, but I want to do something, so to speak, even more primitive. So we're given, in the first premise, at least some students study logic. I'm going to draw a circle, and this represents all students. – 'Each student is contained within that circle. And we're told that some of them, at least some of them, study logic. So here we have logic students. And we have this overlap because some students are also logic students. And we're told in the second premise that all students who study logic know the word premise. So each logic student knows the word premise. That is to say, they're contained in that circle, each and every one of them. So that overlap, of course, so to speak, still holds, so the conclusion does follow. Therefore, some students know the word premise. We have a valid argument. And we can use our intuition to see this with our diagram. Or we can just use our verbal logic, our verbal reasoning. Because all logic students know the word premise, and at least some students also study logic, it must be the case that at least some students know that word premise. What about 3? We're told Plato was a Greek philosopher. Some Greek philosophers were citizens of Athens. Therefore, Plato was a citizen of Athens. Notice in the second premise, we're told that some Greek philosophers were citizens of Athens. We're not told that all of them were citizens of Athens. In the first premise, we're told that Plato was a Greek philosopher. Would it thereby follow that Plato was a citizen of Athens? Doesn't seem so. How could it be? We only know that some Greek philosophers, at least some of them, were citizens of Athens. We're not told that all Greek philosophers were citizens of Athens, so this has to be an invalid argument. In traditional logic, we would call this the fallacy of the undistributed middle. And we can look at it this way. Plato is the subject in the conclusion, and the predicate, what describes the subject, is a citizen of Athens. And in traditional logic, we would think about this in the following terms. We would say that we can relate that subject and predicate by way of the so-called middle term. And the middle term in this case happens to be Greek philosopher. But we don't know its full distribution. We only know a part of it. We only know about some Greek philosophers, not all. So because this middle term is undistributed, because we don't know the full extension, we cannot thereby, because of that undistributed middle, we cannot link the subject and predicate the way we did. It just doesn't follow. In 15, we have, let's see, all A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. I think just using our verbal reasoning, we can see right away that that is valid. We could also draw it, I suppose. So we'll have A happens to be a member of B, and that has to be a member of C. So A must also be, so to speak, a member of C. Or in other words, kind of being loose with the terminology here, but we're just using our intuition, after all. It therefore follows that all A is C. Oh, by the way, I just kind of, for number 3, just a little side note, the conclusion actually is true. Plato was a citizen of Athens. It just is invalid. Aristotle wasn't a citizen of Athens, although he lived in Athens during a couple of periods in his life. He was a resident alien, which was also known as a metic, M-E-T-I-C. So Aristotle was not a citizen of Athens. Plato was. Exercise 1B will be our final exercise. We're to suggest a conclusion that you think would follow. Because propositional logic will not help us here, we must resort to our intuitions. Number 2 tells us no atomic sentences contain connectives. But this sentence is an atomic sentence, therefore, ... what follows? Now, one way we can think about this is to notice that in the first premise we have this no declarative. It's a negative universal statement. It's saying that absolutely no atomic sentences contain connectives. It's a very universal, very broad statement, whereas in the second premise we have this. This sentence is an atomic sentence. is particularized. In fact, it's particularized to an individual. So there's a sense in which we can interpret the first premise as the major premise, and the second premise as the minor premise. It's more particularized. And in a sense, the major premise is going to rule over that minor premise, so to dictate what we're going to derive from those two premises. Because we have this sentence an atomic sentence, but we also know no atomic sentence can contain connectives. It must be the case that this sentence does not contain connectives. So thus, the sentence does not contain connectives. And also another little hint here. In these categorical syllogisms, you will find that in the two premises, there's an overlap of terms. And in this case, it's atomic sentences. We have atomic sentences here, and we have atomic sentences here. That's called the so-called middle term in Aristotelian logic. And in a categorical syllogism, it never ever will appear in the conclusion. So that's also a hint in terms of what you should be able to derive from your two given premises. You know that the conclusion will not contain the term or the expression atomic sentences. It will not contain the middle term. In fact, the middle term is what allows us to relate our two premises, to relate our subject and our predicate. How about number 3? Some mammals are herbivorous animals, but no herbivorous animals are meat eaters, therefore, ... what follows? We have something a little similar to our last problem, or our last argument. In our second premise, we have this no statement. It's an absolute, categorical, universal declaration, and it's negative. The first premise, we have something more particularized with that some. So, in one interpretation, we can say that the second premise is our major premise, and our first premise is our minor premise. And that major premise, so to speak, in one sense we might say, will rule over that minor premise. Moreover, notice that herbivorous appears in both premises, so that is the middle term. It will not appear in the conclusion. We have no herbivorous animals are meat eaters, but some mammals are herbivorous animals. So it must be the case that some are not meat eaters. So that major premise is making us think about the subject of mammals and allowing us to infer something about mammals, to attribute something to mammals, namely that some are not meat eaters. So we have, thus, some mammals are not meat eaters. How about number 5? We have none of the committee members is present, but all of the persons, let me fix that typo, persons, but all of the persons directly affected by the amendment are present. Here we're something a little different in that in our first premise we have this none statement, so it's an absolute universal declaration, but we also have something similar, but in the positive direction, so to speak. We have an all statement. It's not a some statement, it's an all statement. So how we think about major and minor might be a little bit modified here. And I don't want to get it too technical into Aristotelian logic and its terminology, because that'll just be confusing for our purposes here. But there's a sense in which, and I'll try to explain this in a moment, we can consider the second premise as the major and the first premise as the minor. But notice, for example, that present, this term, must be the middle term. It appears in both premises. Now, to note on the side, the reason I'm treating the first premise as the minor premise is because it will contain the subject of the conclusion, whereas the major premise will contain the predicate. The predicate is just an attribute. It's just describing in some way the subject. So we're given all the persons directly affected by the amendment are present, but none of the committee members is present. So what would follow about the committee members? They're not present, so it must mean that they're not affected by the amendment. So in that sense, the major premise is, so to speak, affecting that minor premise. It's affecting the subject. It's allowing us to derive something about that subject. That's our conclusion. Thus, none of the committee members is directly affected by the amendment. And at least in terms of how I look at it, or at least one way I look at it, is that this major premise is really what is influencing how we're thinking about this subject. But in any case, I think our intuitions can see, I hope, why that conclusion would follow from those premises. And with predicate logic, we'll be able to see even more clearly why this is the case. And that's going to be coming up in the next few videos. So coming up next is terms, section 5.2, and this is where we really begin predicate logic. Here we just covered what the limitation of propositional logic is and try to use our intuition a little bit in terms of different types of arguments we have not seen yet. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon with the next video.